Madam President, I rise today to talk about our nation's security and what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, recently said is the greatest threat to America's future. He mentioned not too long ago that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Not al-Qaeda, not the Iranian nuclear threat, not instability in the Middle East or Russian spies, but our national debt. That's a stunning statement, but I think that it's backed up by the numbers. We are more than $14 trillion in debt. In 220 years of American history up to the beginning of 2009 and 43 American presidents, it took us that amount of time to pile up $6.3 trillion of publicly held debt. Under the Obama administration's latest budget, we will double that in another 2 years and triple it in 10. That budget calls for a sizable annual deficit every single year for the next 10 years. The smallest budget deficit we would face would be $607 billion in the year 2015, and then our deficits would start rising again. That's what the White House calls a balanced budget. I would call it a joke, but it's no laughing matter. And we just learned that China holds even more of our debt than the Treasury had previously thought, 26% of total U.S. debt held by foreigners. The President's budget, inevitably, would add to that. Now, that crushing debt burden that we are imposing on future generations will seriously limit their ability to live the American dream. For generations in this country, parents have sacrificed so that their children could have a better life. But today, Madam President, we are standing that tradition on its head. Excessive spending and debt threaten to make the next generation the first in our history to have a lower standard of living than the one that came before. That was not what my parents did. My father fought in World War II. He worked hard as a teacher, a coach. He drove the school bus, ran a motel in my hometown, basically did any job he could get and made whatever sacrifice he needed to make in order to keep our family fed, clothed, and sheltered. His father before him, my grandfather, traveled to this country from Norway and worked doing hard labor, laying the railroad across the plains. He started his own hardware store and ran it through the Depression and the war until he couldn't work anymore. He knew what it meant to sacrifice to take care of his family. But today, Washington seems to be saying that the generations to follow us will have to sacrifice so we won't have to make the tough choices. We don't want to do the hard work of living within our means, and so our children, our grandchildren, will just have to get by on less. Mr. President, Madam President, every one of us in this Congress should be ashamed of that prospect. But more than shame for what we are doing to future generations, we should be alarmed about what we are doing to our economy today. That skyrocketing debt means a burden of uncertainty on our businesses, small and large alike. When businesses and people are uncertain if there will be a fiscal crisis, they limit their investment. Added to the stifling amount of overregulation coming out of Congress and the administration the past 2 years, it means that businesses have one more reason to worry about whether they can afford to add another person to the payroll, and that means fewer jobs. One influential study, endorsed by none other than Treasury Secretary Geithner, found that countries with very high debt burdens suffer from lower economic growth rates. Median growth rates for countries with public debt above roughly the 90% of GDP threshold are about 1% lower than otherwise. The reasons for this are simple. Government borrowing crowds out private investment. The less productive public sector takes resources that could and would be better used by the more productive private sector. We've already crossed the dangerous 90% threshold. Gross debt was 93% of GDP at the end of last fiscal year, and we'll top the 100% barrier by the end of this fiscal year. And under the President's budget, Madam President, the debt will continue to grow rapidly, eventually reaching 107% of GDP. That's even with the gimmicks and questionable assumptions that the White House budget proposal contains, including what I believe are very unrealistic economic growth assumptions. President Obama's own economic advisors have estimated that a 1% increase in GDP translates into 1 million more jobs. Many more people would have jobs today if it weren't for this crushing debt burden. Now, we did finally have some good news last Friday about private sector job creation. Nobody was happier than I was to see that. But the fact remains that the labor force participation rate in the latest unemployment figures was unchanged at 64.2%, the lowest level it's been since the early 1980s. A lot of workers have been so discouraged with the lack of jobs that they've simply stopped looking. And let's not forget that our recovery so far has lagged far behind past recessions. At this point, after the 1981-1982 recession, the economy had already expanded 10%. But the current recovery has only expanded the economy by 0.14%. That's not good enough, Madam President. We all know that if we don't act soon to get control of federal spending and our soaring debt, then any good news will be short-lived. For 2 years, the Pied Pipers of big government told us that they could spend their way out of financial troubles, that the money was free and it would lead to jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, they were wrong. And 2 years of their policies have left us dramatically worse off. It's simple. Too much government spending means too much government debt. That means a weaker economy and fewer jobs. And I think we are finally at the point where most people, even here in Washington, are willing to concede that we need to get a handle on our spending. Even the Obama administration, the biggest spending White House in history, has finally come around to the realization that just maybe we should let the credit card cool off a little bit. Well, there's no better time in America's history to change course regarding federal spending. We are at a moment when we are about to get hit by a succession of 3 budgetary waves. First, the end of the 2-week continuing resolution on March 18th. Then we will have to address the debt limit sometime this spring. And after we've dealt with those 2 things, we need to take up the budget for fiscal year 2012 because the new fiscal year is only 6 months away. Now, none of those is a mystery. None of them snuck up on us. We've seen them all coming. We've had plenty of warning. So we have no excuse for being unprepared. And I'm confident we can come together and solve all 3 of those issues. We showed we can do it with the 2-week CR, finding $4 billion of spending that we could agree was not our most important national priority right now and could be cut. And thanks to the great work of our friend and colleague, Dr. Coburn, the GAO has confirmed that there are hundreds of billions of dollars in waste and duplication we can begin to scrub out of our federal budget. That's our short-term situation, those 3 challenges. But there's also been talk of a balanced budget amendment, and I'm a co-sponsor of 2 balanced budget amendments. That's not a short-term fix, that's a long-term issue. So that's the short-term and the long-term, Madam President. In the midterm, we need to come up with additional solutions to get us off what I'd call federal fiscal irresponsibility, budgetary brinksmanship, and deficits as far as the eye can see. We need to get back on the path to prosperity, and that path cannot be built on borrowed money and reckless spending. Getting back on the right path is going to require us to fix our broken budget process. To that end, I am proud to reintroduce a bill that I introduced last year that would establish common sense reforms to improve transparency and efficiency in our budgeting process. And I'm proud that Senators Chambliss, Crapo, Inhofe, Johans, Kirk, Portman, and Wicker have joined me in co-sponsoring Senate Bill 439, the Deficit Reduction and Budget Reform Act of 2011. If we don't do something to fix this broken system, and soon, we are going to keep getting hit by these budget waves, and sooner or later, they are going to sink us. My proposal has 3 main parts. The first is budget reforms. I propose that we start by reforming pay-go rules to prevent the double-counting gimmicks that too often are used around here, particularly with regard to our trust funds. We saw that double counting occur during the health care debate last year when hundreds of billions of dollars were double counted, essentially spent twice during the health care debate. My proposal would make the federal budget a binding joint resolution signed into law by the President. Today, it is a non-binding resolution and routinely gets waived. My proposal calls for a biannual budget timeline, more time for oversight, and to see what's working. And doing a budget in every other year during the odd-numbered years, and then during the even-numbered years, doing oversight, so instead of looking for ways to spend taxpayer dollars, we look for ways to save taxpayer dollars. a legislative line item veto. Governors have it, the President should too. My proposal calls for preventing the abuse of emergency spending designations, which again have become all too routine and all too frequent around here to get around spending caps. My proposal calls for the creation of a new Class Act trigger if that new entitlement program is not solvent over a 75-year time frame. I would also modify the Medicare cost containment trigger to have honest accounting with respect to revenues and savings in the new health care bill. And my proposal also would update the Credit Reform Act to score the purchases of debt, stock, equity, and capital using a discount rate that incorporates market risk rather than the procedure that's been used in the past, which in my view completely understates the cost of many of these programs. And Madam President, I would call for a new standing joint committee of Congress for budget deficit reduction. If you can believe this, there are 26 committees or subcommittees that spend tax dollars, not one that saves tax dollars. That joint committee would be responsible for producing a bill to cut the deficit by at least 10% every budget cycle without raising taxes. This bill would get expedited consideration in both chambers of Congress. And only spending reductions, Mr. President, not tax increases. Tax increases would be off the table. The standing committee, not just issuing one report and closing up shop, its recommendations would get an up or down vote in Congress. And Mr. President, it is interesting to me, there is a precedent for doing this, and I see the senator from West Virginia on the floor. But back in the 1940s, there was a senator from West Virginia named Harry Byrd, who, as they were debating whether or not to raise taxes to fund World War II, came up with an idea and said, before we do that, we ought to look at savings that we can find in our federal budget. And so he proposed a joint committee called the Joint Committee on the Reduction of Non-Essential Federal Expenditures. And they went about the process of scrubbing the federal budget to see if there might be savings that could be achieved that would prevent having to raise taxes to fund the war effort. In the process of doing that, that committee achieved a great many things. It was in existence for about 30 years. And so what this would do, Mr. President, is draw on that precedent and create a joint standing committee in the Congress that would be bicameral, 10 House members, 10 Senate members, bipartisan, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats, who would have a statutory requirement each budget cycle, I should say, for coming up with a specified amount of savings in deficit reduction through spending reductions. Now, what will we do in the short term? This proposal, Mr. President, would freeze and cap spending. It would pose a 10-year spending freeze at 2008 levels adjusted for inflation. After all, non-defense discretionary spending has increased at an alarming rate since 2008, 22% increase when inflation has amounted to roughly 2%. In other words, non-defense discretionary spending has grown in the last 2 years, Mr. President, at 10 times the rate of inflation. Now, as I said, this is not a quick fix. No plan is going to solve our problems overnight. And I hope we don't take seriously anyone who claims to have a plan that will. But just the same, I don't think we should take seriously any plan that claims an annual deficit of $607 billion is the same as a balanced budget. It's not the same, and it's not good enough. The only thing that is good enough for our children and for the future prosperity of this great country is for us to get our fiscal house in order and to embrace responsible budgeting. We cannot continue to spend money we don't have, Mr. President. We have to learn, like the American people have, to live within their means. We have to learn how to tighten our belt. And I want to close with a couple of statements that are, I mentioned earlier, the statement by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, with regard to the greatest threat facing America's national security being our national debt. But I also want to quote what Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the unexpected $1.3 trillion U.S. deficit. She referred to it as a message of weakness internationally. And she went on to say, and I quote, "It poses a national security threat in two ways. It undermines our capacity to act in our own interest, and it does constrain us where constraint may be undesirable," end quote. That's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton with regard to these year-over-year massive deficits that we continue to run. And just today we heard that PIMCO, one of the largest mutual funds in the country, has decided to dump government debt. It's government debt. And in that story that came out today that was discussing that particular move on their part, there was a quote from a gentleman, Jim Rogers, I should say, who was the co-founder of the Quantum Fund. And he said, and I quote, "U.S. government bonds are not a safe haven. I cannot conceive of lending money to the United States government for 30 years, end quote. I mean, think about that, Mr. President. The United States of America is being viewed increasingly as an unsafe investment because of this massive debt that we are running and what it could mean to the future with regard to inflation and interest rates and the health of our economy and its attractiveness to people not only here at home but around the world as a place for an investment. We have a major, major problem. These are serious times. These are serious problems. These are serious challenges. They require serious solutions and serious leadership. And I hope here in the United States Senate that we are up to that. And as I said before, it starts on several levels. In the near term, we need to get the spending under control. We're trying to do that with the discretionary spending bill that is in front of us. We need to deal with the longer-term issue, and I hope we can pass a balanced budget amendment. We've had votes on that in the past here in Congress, unsuccessfully, narrowly, but we need to put in place what so many states have that require them on an annual basis to balance their budgets. And then we need to put in place budget process reforms that, in my view, will put more of a straitjacket on the Congress and force us to make more of these hard decisions. And I think, frankly, that because we do this every year, this budget every year, we get very preoccupied with 12 appropriation bills and a budget, although last year we didn't even pass a budget, nor did we pass a single appropriation bill, which is a major, major failure of this Congress when you're running a $3.7 trillion enterprise called the federal government. But we need to provide in our annual schedule time to do oversight, time to look at what we can be doing not to spend more money but to save money. And if we had a biannual budget process where we're spending money in odd-numbered years and doing the appropriation bills in those years, and then in the even-numbered years when people go home to run for re-election, instead of looking for ways to spend money, we're actually looking for ways to save money, I think these are reforms that are long overdue, Mr. President. And so I hope my colleagues will take seriously this issue of budget process reform. I know it's not a glamorous subject. In fact, I think most people's eyes glaze over when you talk about budget process reform. But in my view, there isn't anything that we could do that would more fundamentally change the way that Washington works than reform this budget process, because it drives everything else. And if we don't start there, we're never going to get this issue of spending and debt under control in the long term. And so, Mr. President, I thank my colleagues who have co-sponsored this bill. I would hope that there will be more colleagues who will join on this bill, and if not this one, something like it, that will, once and for all, change the way that Washington works by undertaking reforms in our budget process here that will lead us to greater fiscal responsibility and greater prosperity for future generations. Mr. President, I yield the floor.